This is the School Success Podcast, a podcast for school leaders to learn from other school leaders what's working and what's not, and to get inspiration and encouragement, as well as strategies to grow school enrollment, connect with families, retain teachers, recruit teachers, and everything in between. You guys are heroes, and I cannot thank you enough for pouring into this next generation that's coming behind us. My goal is you will take at least one thing away from every episode that you can take back to your school to make it better than it is right now. Please enjoy the School Success Podcast.
Time for school.
Hey, School Success Makers. Today we're joined by my new friend Daniel Simon out of the great state of North Carolina. He's a leadership coach and consultant, and when I met him, I was like, man, he has a lot of information and strategies that he can share with these school leaders that listen to the podcast like yourselves. So I was like, I have to have him on. So here he is on the podcast today. So please stay tuned and enjoy this next episode of the School Success Podcast. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the School Success Podcast. I'm your host, Mitchell Slater, joined by a new friend out of Anger, North Carolina, which is right outside of Raleigh, Mr. Dan Simon with Dan Simon Solutions, and he is an educational consultant expert. He's been in education for well over 30 years, I believe it is. He can correct me if I'm wrong in a second, but he's been doing this for a long time. He knows schools. He knows how to help schools. So I was like, hey, this would be a great guest to have on as a special episode. So I don't want to take any thunder away from him. I'll pass it off to Mr. Dan. So Mr. Dan, welcome to the podcast, sir.
Thank you so much, Mitchell. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I'm so glad we were able to connect. And yes, you're right. It is over 30 years, although, it's at age 39. I don't know how that's possible, but yes, I've been doing a lot of work for a long time. Started like everybody else, humble beginnings in a classroom, working my way through leadership opportunities, and department chair, supervisor, principal, superintendent, opened a charter school, retired, working now in faith-based private school. I'll tell you, I've been blessed, Mitch, to work with some really great people over the years, and I'm just excited to talk to you about whatever we want to talk about. There's so many topics I'm sure that we could cover, and not enough time to do it.
For sure. And there's so many we can dive into, which I have questions already, but I always want to start with the same question I ask typically everybody. So if I was to ever come visit you in Anger, North Carolina, what would we do for fun? What is something to do there in that area? You said it's right outside Raleigh, so I know a great food scene in the Raleigh-Durham area, but what would you say is really fun to do in that area that you're from?
Oh gosh, drive some country back roads. Being a guy from New Jersey originally, didn't get a lot of opportunities like that. So I think we would just go for a drive and check out lots of nice open space, some peace and quiet, a little bit of escape from the craziness. You want that, and just go a little bit north to Raleigh and get plenty of it. But down where I live in Anger, even though it's growing, lots of places to just kind of get away, get some peace and quiet, and just be kind of one with God's creation. That's how I look at it.
All right. Sounds like a plan, man. Well, your background, obviously, you've been in there for a long time in education. You probably you see what the typical struggles or challenges that a school kind of faces. And so typically the guests that we have on, I ask them kind of three typical questions. Hey, what are some challenges you guys are up against, and how are you combating those? That's kind of that first one. If you were to see from the outside looking in, what are some of those challenges that you feel like you've seen schools maybe just right now they're struggling with? I know there's some hot topic ones right now in the USA right now, but from your perspective, what are some of these challenges that schools are up against, and how are they combating them, or how should they be combating those?
Yeah, and it's a different world when you're in private education, right? Because you can dictate a little bit more of how you're going to structure your environment, your school environment, your student body, your staff, what you want to teach, what you're not going to teach, especially faith-based, right? I mean, that's what I'm seeing as I've shifted into faith-based education. But even in my continued work with public education, I think one of the differences is generationally, right? We see students that have difficulty making decisions, choices, right? Because their lives, they're saturated with choices, right? I think there's some statistic that talks about, I don't have it at the top of my head, but I mean, how often and how many decisions students are making during the course of a day. Way, way, way more than we did growing up, right? And technology is part of that. And so engaging students is one of the most critical areas. We can't educate the way we used to, right? I mean, the old kind of stand and deliver, the old kind of chalk and talk, and the ways that many of us even just a generation ago grew up learning, right? We tend to teach the way we learned, and it doesn't work with this generation. And so we have to be more conscious of engaging. They have to feel more stake in the game in terms of what we do. I've always been one as a school leader that has prioritized culture and communication and relationships. And that goes beyond just the staff. It also involves the students. I would run student advisories, and my student advisories would always include a variety of representation from our student body. So it would never just be your elected, most popular students. You'd be drawing from kind of every facet of your school, every ethnicity, interest level, introverts, right? To get the finger on the pulse. Because if we want to know how to reach students, we've got to talk to students. We've got to find out what they're going through and how can we help them. Because the level of anxiety, especially coming out of COVID, I mean, for goodness sake, the last 2 years, so many students have just lost their ability to communicate, to socialize, and they kind of forget, if they ever knew how, depending on how old they are, right, how to get along with other people face-to-face, conversationally. So for me, it comes down to relationship. It comes down to building trust. It comes down to vulnerability as a leader. How often we have to be willing to admit we make mistakes. How often we have to be willing to say, hey, I'd like to know what you think about this. I mean, and middle school students turn around and say, are you talking to me? Like, you really want to know what I think? So that establishes the kind of relationship where students respect you as a school leader more, even if they don't ultimately agree with the decision you make. But because you've engaged them in the process and you really hear them and you really listen to them, you tend to partner more. And it's the same with parents as well. You've got to establish relationships with parents right away, right? We are all partners in this process. So the answer to the question I think I have always found, Mitchell, is in building relationships, being an open, vulnerable, transparent communicator. And in doing that, when you build that kind of trust, there really isn't any mountain you can't climb together.
Yeah, and I think giving those kids, like you just said, that building that friendship with them, because they're gonna they're gonna listen to you more. And I always did that. I mean, going back for years now, I was a youth pastor years ago, and I always, rewind it even further back. It was like the first pastor that I was under, and he was like, hey, I don't want you to be their friends, I want you to be their pastor. And I was like, I get what you're saying, but I don't agree with that. And when I went to this new church years ago, I said, hey, this is my philosophy. I really want to build friendship with these kids because they're going to share things with me, and they're going to, he's like, yeah, I love that. And so, man, the cool story I love to share, and I think I've shared this on this other podcast episode, was when a kid came to me and he's like, hey, Pastor Mitchell, I'm going to invite you to my birthday party. We're going to go snowboarding together. And I was like, you want to invite your pastor to snowboard with all your high school buddies? And he's like, yeah. He goes, you're one of my friends. And I was like, bro, I said, I will be there. And so and him and I had great conversations over coffee and lunches and stuff like that really just get to know each other. And I think they're so important because when you have that relationship, you'll learn things from them, you'll hear things, they'll be receptive to what you have to say. So I totally agree with that. And that even just, like you said too, goes into the parent side of a thing. If you can have a relationship with those parents, man, that's a game changer. Yeah. A teacher can be really in a good friendship, or I don't know again, I know there's blurred lines.
It's a partnership. Yeah, Mitch, you know what, you're spot on. And my philosophy has always been, and it was probably the way I operated even before I was at a faith-based school, but I call it grace with accountability, right? Honestly, parenting is the same way. And in terms of working with clients, like, we talk about this often too, about the struggles they have, is grace with accountability. I mean, we're not going to ever stop loving our children, right? And our students are the same way. But it doesn't mean that, even as you said in the phrase, to be their friend. Like, to be their friend doesn't have to mean that you let them get away with everything, right? Because hopefully, especially as believers, right, we hold each other accountable in some ways to behaviors and the words we choose and the way we treat others, because our witness is completely dependent on what we do more than what we say, right? So Like, I'm very conscious of that with students. Like, if I'm going to hold them to a standard, I better make sure that I'm held to the same standard, and I want them to hold me to that standard. I had a group of boys in here this year that I had said something in conversation when I was frustrated, and after the fact, I brought them all in. I laid it out there and I told them that I was wrong for, the tone that I used and for the way, they were like, no, we understand. Like, I know you understand, but I need to model this for you too. Like, I expect you to act a certain way. You need to see that in the teachers and the leaders around you. And again, parents the same way. Like, I can still love you, but sometimes loving you means saying no. Or sometimes loving you means holding you accountable for what you did or what you said. And that's the only way we're going to ever change the culture. And look, even in a faith-based school, I think people tend to think that sending a child to a faith-based school, a Christian school, or any other faith-based school, is going to solve all the issues that they may have had in a public school environment. And I actually welcome those conversations at times, because I had 25 years in public schools before I retired and went a different direction. And I said, last time I checked, the same kids that are in public school are the same kids that are in private school, and the key is that they're kids, right? So it's not what they do or what they say, it's how we respond to them that's the key. And if we're going to be a faith-based institution, we have to make sure we're modeling that in every facet of what we do.
I love that conversation you had with them, because they're going to remember that for years. And I love using past stories for examples, but I remember when I was early on in ministry as a youth pastor, I went to a friend of mine and I was like, man, I feel like I'm not making a difference. I said, I'm teaching these lessons every week, and I don't know if they're remembering them or getting anything out of them. And my friend sat me down, he's like, well, do you love the students? And I was like, yeah, of course I do. And he's like, do they know that you love them? And I was like, yeah, like, yes, I know they do. And he goes, you're doing a great job, Mitchell. And I was like, what do you mean? He goes, 10 years, 20 years from now, he goes, they're not going to remember a thing you said. Like, they're not going to remember a lesson you taught them, but they are going to remember how you made them feel, how they felt when they were at church, and that love, that will last forever. And they'll go, man, why did Pastor Mitchell love me so much? Man, maybe it was because of Jesus, or maybe because, and that's always stuck with me to go, man, it's not, yes, I still want them to learn and grow, but that is not almost the most important thing. Sometimes it's, they feel appreciated, accepted, loved, and all that. And I feel like that the kids are going to remember that conversation you had and go, man, Dan, like, that's a big thing what Dan just did. I need to do that too if I make a mistake.
Yeah, and Mitchell, it's funny because we sometimes just say that about kids, but the reality is it's true of the adults too. It's true of the staff members. I mean, I've been blown away in the past, right? One thing I've always prioritized is making sure that I know the names of my staff. Like, most of the time, even before I get in, I try to get in to do interviews. I'm usually available in the summer before I start, and I want to get to know them, and I send them a questionnaire, and I want to know about their families. And then when I meet them for the first time, I call them by name. Like, something as simple as that makes all the difference in the world. I mean, I remember one school that I started, and I was calling the teachers by name, when I first met them, and one of them stopped me and said, we're all talking about this. Like, the person that you replaced here was here for like 5.5 years, still didn't know some of our names. And so, like, here in the first week, they're like, you talk about making an impression, right? And, asking about family and things like that, that doesn't change. And then the same thing when I'm working with my adult clients. Like, I know a lot of people who work with clients, they try to make it about the content in the sense like, I have this formula or I have this plan to follow. And when I was inspired by a couple of people that I had worked with for a long time to say, you should really go this route of kind of taking your experience and everything and working one-on-one with clients. And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think I'm that special, really. And then they said, well, you should go out and get some testimonials from people that you worked with and let that dictate for you. And I was blown away by it, Mitchell. I think I try to pride myself on being humble, so it's hard to talk about it. But I couldn't believe what some people were saying about the difference that I made in their lives just because of how I connected with them and I cared about them. And this is adults now, not even just kids. And former students who are now adults who have come back and said, you have no idea the impact that you made. So my approach in leadership in a formal school setting is about showing value right? John Maxwell talks about that all the time, right? How are you adding value to others? And that's what I believe in as a leader. But as a consultant now, I have found I have to do a lot of listening, and there is no one plan that fits everyone. And so, my coaching is from biblical perspective, right? That's how I believe I've been led is I'm not creating some formula that works for everybody, but what works for me is the word of God. And so I'm going to use that. And whether you believe or don't believe on the other end, just know that I do. And it's what's led me to what I believe is a success as a parent. I've been blessed as a parent, of grandparent to 3. Just found out that there's going to be a couple more grandkids coming, which, I mean, it's just so blessed. But watching all of my kids interact with other people in much the same way, where feedback that they get is very similar about, we just know you care. And me, as a parent, I feel, as a parent, a school leader, that's what it's all about. That's the things that we're going to be remembered by. That's our legacy, right?
I love it. Love it. Well, you talked about some challenges. What have you seen? I usually go into the next question with guests is like, hey, what's going really good at your school that you get a chance to brag about? So I'd love to even hear from you, as you've talked with schools and you've been in schools for so long, like what do you see schools doing really, really good, like right now, that from your perspective that you've seen from the outside looking in, of like, man, this school's doing really cool things. Just my goal is to hopefully that anybody who's listening, you'll go, oh, I never thought about doing that before. I never thought about that idea.
Right. So I've done most of my work on secondary level, most middle and high school for the most part. I think one thing I'm seeing, it kind of reverts back to what I was talking about before about students and what their needs are. And what I've been really impressed is that schools are looking at all the options that can really meet the needs of their students, because their student bodies are so diverse. And so, we all know, I mean, students have no choice but to be in school, right? I mean, it is their job. And so, down here where I am now is a much more rural area than where I've been. And so, you have a lot of students here they're really just going to get through high school, and they don't really have plans to go to secondary ed. They don't necessarily need it. There's a family business that they're going to inherit, or they're already working towards. And so what is the goal of our educational experience for them, right? It's about being a problem solver, learning how to critically think, learning how to cooperate and work with others, and learning how to offer whatever talent you have that you've been blessed with and use it to the fullest potential. And so when we pigeonhole every student into the same type of path, that's going to work for some. But it's not going to work for all, and it may not even work for most, depending on the environment that you're in, because students are coming from all different kinds of backgrounds. And when you are in a public school setting, right, and you kind of have had control of the path, you kind of know where most of your students are coming from. But that's another challenge to private schools is, you're getting students coming in all the time from many different places. Homeschool, public, other private, military, a lot of big military presence down here. So a lot of transiency there. What do they need? And again, how do we know what they need unless we're asking them? So what I've seen in schools that I have seen be very successful in this is that they have started to kind of throw away the old model of one size fits all for all students, and have started to look at a flexibility. We talk about COVID almost always in negative terms, of course, right? Because of what it did to families and what it did to society. But one of the positives that came out of this last 2 years is that schools have learned how to be flexible. Schools have learned how to pivot. And so there are a lot of things that, even as we're getting back to, the new normal, I guess, put that in quotes, a lot of schools are sticking with some things that they did during that time period because they worked. They worked in being able to give students flexibility. But think about it. If you're sick, right, and you missed school, right, it was sure. So what happened? You come to school sick because, you didn't want to miss school. And what would happen? You'd get other kids sick, right? So, during the pandemic, schools that stayed open and had, safety protocols in place had the highest attendance rates that they ever had before, because students who were sick following protocols were staying home. still getting educated, and everyone else who was healthy was coming to school. So you weren't seeing the spread of, the general sickness like you were before. So there are certain things schools have learned about, hey, we can still allow students to be educated and not physically be here and continue that kind of momentum, that academic momentum. And then they began to get very savvy. Mitchell, I remember 2 years ago in a school that I was working in, everyone was talking about this Google Classroom, right? Google Classroom, like, this sounds really cool. And the response of most teachers was, sounds great, I'd love to learn it. When I have time, I'll learn it. And then overnight, right, everyone was kind of like, I need to learn Google Classroom. And it became the kind of the standard, along with obviously other resources. And now those same people can't imagine teaching without it. So I think that what I've seen schools do very effectively is they have become resourceful. They have learned to kind of, again, listen to the people, to their families, to their students about what their needs are and how they can maintain an educational consistency even in the midst of the challenge and the crisis we were facing. And as we transition back, just thinking through things in a new, unique way and not being afraid of change, right? Because we've all seen the forced change over the last 2 years has led to some really positive results.
Yeah, and I've seen that for sure, like the adapt or die type of thing. If you had to adapt, or you're going to lose people. And I know you had different, the public schools and the private schools, all of them had different hills to climb with that. But it's been really interesting seeing the private schools and how they've navigated stuff and how not held by the same standards. So some people came over to the private schools, so like, oh, I want my kid in school, and they weren't shut down as much. And it's just interesting to see how people did navigate it. We've had some really good Christian school guests on the podcast, and hearing from them where they've talked about COVID a little bit and how they just took a leap and said, we're going to try this and see how it works. And it worked. Now, granted, I know everybody doesn't have one that did work out, but it has been same with the business sector, of course, as well. People are like, oh, I need to have online ordering. I don't have that set up. I need to get online ordering set up immediately. So it really pushed everybody. And if people weren't ready to adapt, they kind of just went away, and they got, the new guy came into the block. The new young generation came in. So I totally agree with you. It's been very interesting in watching that. And I'm glad that they embrace the technology that's out there to better what they're doing. And we can't always do what we used to do. I'll use another story. Christianese talking, I guess, is what I'd say for this. It's like how we always talked about how in church, like the gospel never changes, but the way you do church is going to change. And it's the same thing with school. Like we're always going to educate and love kids, but like the way we do that is going to have to change as technology comes in like this, or COVID comes in. Yes. It's always going to have to change, but we're always going to love and educate our students, because that's what our jobs are, what we're supposed to do.
Right. Yeah, Mitch, I'm a podcast listener. Obviously, that's how I came across your work, but I listened to a lot of different pastors, and I remember hearing one, Pastor Greg Rochelle, talking about at one point about decisions, right? And that's been, I would say, my biggest theme with our students. He did a message once on pre-deciding, right? Something that we all, as adults, can do better at. And students as well. That thought process of what I'm thinking, what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do, how it's going to impact someone else, and being prepared for it before it happens, right? So that in the moment when I'm emotionally tied, because I always use middle school as an example, right? Because you called me, a fathead, right? And so what am I going to do? I'm immediately going to call you something, back, because that's just what we do. Well, if we train ourselves, in a sense, to pre-decide how, when that happens, how I'm going to respond, how if somebody gets physical with me, how if somebody's doing something they shouldn't be doing, how I'm going to respond in those situations, it makes all the difference in the world. And that's something where we as adults need to model that. And it's not always easy, because we're human too. And so teachers get frustrated. And sometimes they let out a side. And when you're a faith-based school and you've got students who are believers and you've got students who aren't, right? They're always looking for our example. And so again, and I've heard this too. Kids say and parents say, like, I thought this was going to be different. It's a Christian school, And I've got teachers that are, talking about my kid behind their back. And, so number one, obviously, I want to be able to address that. But number two, I just want to say, again, even more the reason and the recognition of why you're here, because we are all fallen. We are all of a sin nature. And so we all need to repent and we all need forgiveness. And that goes, from kids on to adults. And that's what we teach here, right? That's what we try to model. So that's one area. And then I've become a huge fan because, right at the beginning of the pandemic, you remember, is where we ended up having the buildup of racial tension as well in our nation. And, not that it's not that it's dissipated. It's, it's perhaps even more magnified because of social media and because of, everybody kind of being locked down for so long. But I have found a tremendous resource in that. Out of San Diego, Pastor Miles McPherson had written a book called The Third Option. And in The Third Option, as part of that, he has created this what's called similarity training. And what I have found to be very impactful is that focus on we are all more similar than we are different. And so what this training does is it walks through so many of us lose focus on ourselves, on labels that we use, and how we put people in groups and out groups. And it just teaches us from a completely non-agenda, non-political base. The book was written from a biblical worldview, but it's also been mainstreamed for the sectarian type of work that they do. Just loving other people, right? I mean, I love the Danny Goki song, right? Love God and love people, right? I mean, that's what we're called to do as Christians, but as educators, we're called to do the same thing. And we can do that. 25 years as a Christian in public school, I still loved on my students the way that Jesus would, right? That was my calling. So we don't have to shed our faith, our beliefs as Christians at the school doors just because we're in public education. And I think that's something people need to know, and they need to be clear about. There are some topics that they may not be comfortable teaching. There are some things that they may feel that it's contrary to what they believe. And they need to be able to stand up for themselves in that way as believers. But it doesn't change the fact that the most important thing we need to do is love on our students. Because it's the only way we're ever going to if you want to say, to get them to follow, right? That old adage, they don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. I mean, it really comes down to that.
Yeah, and thank goodness you were doing that in the public school sector, because of course all those kids need that. They need to be loved. They need to know that somebody's rooting them on and cheering them on and behind them and encouraging them. So thank goodness, because we need more of those people. Not everybody obviously needs to be going over to Christian schools or anything. We need to keep good people all throughout the school system, which shout out to all the teachers. Yeah, there's so many. Yeah.
And there's so many, right? There's so many. And the sad part is there's so many who are being handcuffed. Right? They're not being allowed to love them the way Jesus loves them. So they do the best that they can, and they just love on their students, in every other possible way. But yeah, I mean, I don't, as a 25-year public educator, I don't appreciate people bashing public school, because there are so many great people. There are people who don't have the option of going private school, and so public school is their only option. And there's so many great people. I feel very badly when public school districts and curricula are being hijacked, right? Because, they're getting away from their purpose, right? Which is to teach, if you want to say the old reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? Is to teach the fundamentals and teach them well, and to teach history and provide balance, right? Not to tell students what to think, but teach them how to think. That's what we are lacking. And that's in schools, by the way. Private schools as well can be criticized for the same thing. So we've got to be willing to allow students to communicate, to share what's on their mind, to ask questions, to challenge content that's placed before them, because it's the only way we're going to teach them to be critical thinkers and problem solvers, so that when the world hits them with something new, they'll be ready. They'll be prepared to handle it. They're not going to, crawl in a hole.
100%. Well, as we slowly wrap up the podcast, I want to kind of put it in your court for a little bit as we kind of wrap up. I want to hear from you and how you are there to help schools. I know you do like a lot of leadership consulting, and just to kind of put a little plug in there for what you do and how you help schools. So I kind of just put in your court for a little bit before we wrap up the podcast, Dan.
Sure, Mitchell. Thank you. So much of my work over the years has been in education, and I've done a lot of work particularly with educational leadership, with culture, with trying to help build an atmosphere of collaboration, right? And I'm actually surprised, Mitchell, at how many people really struggle with that. Especially being such a big Maxwell fan. I'm a John Maxwell certified, speaker and consultant, but even before Maxwell, who also, by the way, most of his content is scripturally based, right? It's biblical content. It's not hard to figure that out when you get to the bottom of the main points. But I can't fathom, as someone who I guess has been blessed to be an effective communicator and collaborator, how many people really do struggle with that. And they walk into environments that are toxic and they don't know how to fix them. And they have a culture even amongst their administrative teams sometimes. And I think what they struggle with the most is that willingness to be vulnerable themselves. Because there is this concept, right, that if I'm vulnerable, if I'm transparent, that people are going to walk all over me, they're going to take advantage of me. And I think it's quite the contrary. My entire career, everywhere that I've ever been, whether I've been there a year or whether I've been there 10 years, and again, I try to say this with the most humility because it's kind of hard to say something like this without it, but I feel like I've always left the culture of every place I've been better than I found it. And that's not like my credit. I give the glory to God in that he put me in those environments with the right people who needed to hear what they needed to hear. And we're just waiting for someone to come along and encourage them to take that risk, encourage them to fail. It's okay to fail as long as we view this as something that we're going to kind of get together, pull each other up, and we're going to continue to march forward. So the focus of my work as a consultant is that. It's trying to help school leaders improve their culture, effectively communicate, and with individuals as well. Because most of the time that comes from a lack of confidence in themselves, right? Is that they don't feel as if they have anything to offer. They don't feel confident in their ability to rally the troops. So a lot of my consulting work is also with individuals. And again, unashamedly, Mitchell, I bring a biblical perspective to it because I believe that all the success that I've had are blessings and gifts from God. And so I want to in turn be able to use that and bless someone else with the same tenets that I've learned and I've tried to live out throughout my career. Again, not just as an educator, but as a parent of 6, 4 college graduates, 2 about to graduate, West Point firstie that will be, moving on this year and serving our country. And, I just feel as if it's always been about modeling the teachings, right, of Jesus as the greatest example and following the scriptures as the best instruction manual there is, and allowing people who maybe are believers or maybe aren't believers to begin to understand some of those fundamental premises and let it change you from the inside out. And then when it changes you and you become confident and you become more cognizant of, hey, I'm in this situation because God has placed me here for a time such as this. So I am meant to be working with the people and dealing with the challenges that I'm dealing with right now. And, until God closes this door and opens up another one, I'm going to deal with it. And one of the clients I'm working with now is, just been dealing with so much changeover that she didn't see coming in her company, and recognizes that so much of the talk and the preparation we've been doing has her stabilized. So as this is going on around her, she's at peace and she is very much in a place where she knows this is still part of God's plan. So that's the crux of the work that I do as a consultant. While I'm still continuing to do a lot of work in private coaching, I'm still doing school-based work as well. And I'm getting more and more engaged in organizations that do this kind of work, very specified, as well as general leadership. And it's just, my gosh, there's so many, it'd be hard to name them all, but I'm just grateful, Mitchell, for where God has me and to be able to have used all this experience to just to bless others that are in a place in their life where they're just not sure what to do. And I'm blessed that God's given me the opportunity to work with those folks.
Love it. And if people want to get in touch with you, Dan, what's the best, maybe find you online, what's the best way to do that?
Yeah, so dansimonsolutions.com is my website, and go there. And again, I say with all humility, I could say all I want about myself, but I think the testimonials there are probably the best way to reiterate and solidify some of the things that I've said. And I think you'll see also it's not just at a teacher who was a Marine major who ran the ROTC program. He's quoted on there. I've got a lot of business owners that I have worked with that are friends that are have not even been clients, that just have shared the difference that I've made in just over the time and just having conversations with them. So I would say start there. There's a phone number. There's a contact me. It would be a blessing and an honor to have the opportunity to just even have an initial conversation with someone who may be struggling right now and maybe hasn't thought about the faith-based route. Like maybe that's the piece that's missing. I fully believe that God has led me here because people need to hear that there is another way, there is a better way than just trying to do this on our own or do this the way the world has taught us. God's instruction manual will not return void. And so dansimonsolutions.com would be the place to start.
Awesome. Dan, thank you so much for taking time out of your day. And I know we were back and forth for a while to finally get something scheduled, so I'm glad we finally did. I'm wishing you and your school journey, your consulting journey, obviously nothing but the best, and your 6 kids and new grandbabies coming, all that stuff.
Yay!
Super stoked for you. You got a fun season ahead. And again, wishing you nothing but the best. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you, Mitchell. God bless you and your work. Thanks so much.
Well, another huge shout out and a thank you to Daniel for taking time and being on the podcast today. I loved our chat. I love what he's doing. And I'm hoping, as always, you guys were able to take at least one thing from today's episode that you can take back to your school to make it better than it is right now, or just apply it to yourself to make yourself better than you are right now. There's always room to grow and improve. So I'm hoping you guys are able to do that, because that really is the vision and the goal that I have for this podcast and for you and your schools. So I'm really, really hoping that was able to happen today. If you guys are listening to this episode and you're in a spot with your school that you're trying to figure out how to grow enrollment and get to that next level, but you don't really know how to get there, I would love to hear from you, because we specialize in helping schools do just that. So check us out online, schoolsuccessmakers.com. That's schoolsuccessmakers.com. We'd love to hear from you and help you get to the next level. Or if you're a Facebook user and you just want to join a community of like-minded individuals, you can check out our private Facebook group just for school leaders called School Success Makers. It's on there on Facebook. I'm personally in there. I'd love to see you in there as well. School Success Makers private group on Facebook. We will be here next week with another amazing guest as usual on the School Success Podcast. We'll see you then.